Welcome to End of Life University on YouTube. Today, I am sharing with you a conversation I had with Marian Krawczyk, who is a medical anthropologist interested in the culture of health, illness, and medicine, particularly in relation to the end of life. She is the lead convener for the End of Life Studies program at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. We're going to learn all about the program that she's leading, the students who engage in the program, and it's fascinating. And this might be a program that some of you are interested in participating in the future. So stay tuned. I think you'll learn a lot from this conversation. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to this channel down below using the button. And also subscribe and leave a rating and review for the podcast wherever you happen to listen. Go to eoluniversity.com/support if you're able to make a small contribution to help keep this channel and the podcast on the air. So we'll move on now with my interview with Marian. Today, I'm very happy to welcome my special guest, Marian Krawczyk. Marian is a medical anthropologist interested in the culture of health, illness, and medicine, particularly in relation to the end of life. And she is the lead convener for the End of Life Studies program at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. Her current research is interdisciplinary and focuses on both the history and the future of end-of-life care, which I love that full spectrum look at things. Marian has written extensively about the concept of total pain at the end of life, as well as the growth of the end-of-life doula movement. She's the founder of the End-of-Life Doula International Research Group, which you can learn more about at the website eold.org. And you can also contact Marian at marian.krawczyk at glasgow.ac.uk. I'll leave all those links in the show notes, including the link to the program in Glasgow, which is a little bit too long to read on the podcast. So Marian, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm a longtime listener, first time conversationalist.
Well, I was so delighted to hear about your work and so interested because I really believe death education is an essential path forward for all of us if we want to change the way we're handling end of life issues here in the US, but around the world. And so I was just fascinated to learn about the program you're working with in Scotland. And we are definitely going to get into that, but I'm very curious about your own story and what drew you to end of life studies in the first place, and then on to Scotland to convene this program.
Yeah, well, I think I come to this the same way that pretty much everybody does in this subject area, which is through personal experience. And so I had some people close to me die, and that drew me into doing PhD research, where I conducted a year-long study with hospital-based palliative clinicians, looking at how they negotiate prognostic uncertainty in potential end-of-life contexts. Because one of the things about my experiences was the kind of uncertainty that marked, or that appeared to mark, a lot of the journey that I was on with my family members who died. And so I did my PhD research and then worked in clinical research context, embedded in clinical teams. But as much as I enjoyed that, I also realized that the majority of the end of life happens outside of hospital settings. And so I've become more interested in public health and community interventions. And so I came to Glasgow for a cup of tea, actually. As odd as that sounds, David Clark, Professor David Clark, who's now retired, founded the End of Life Studies program. And I happened to be doing some work in Europe, in Sweden, and I thought, close enough. And so he had written on his website that he was interested in anyone in the field, and I had used his work in my dissertation. So I came and wound up giving a talk to the end of life studies group, and that then turned into a 3-year international fellowship. And then at the end of it, I was offered a permanent position.
Mm.
So, and that position was to start this program, which began in January of 2021.
Mm.
Yeah.
Ah, it's a wonderful story just hearing how how things fall together and how one aspect of our work leads us to something else. And so that's really amazing, and that you were able to say yes to everything and move your life to
Yeah,
Scotland.
I was very lucky, and it's also a very welcoming world, I find. It is academic, but people seem to know each other and look out for each other and try and find ways to collaborate and bring people together under one tent. And so I have found that to be true no matter what country I'm in.
Hmm. And I was interested to read that you've been studying the rise of the end of life doula movement, which I think is really fascinating. And I didn't mention asking you about this before, but it just occurred to me to ask if there's anything you would share about what you've learned about that, or any thoughts about the doula movement.
Well, you have to be careful what you ask for, because be careful what you wish for, because yeah, I've spent quite a few years now engaged with the movement as it develops in different countries. And again, it was a product of just saying yes under what appeared to be just a random interaction with a prominent practitioner in the United States, Mary Rush, who runs the Dying Year. She was at a palliative conference in Canada, and she had a poster up about end-of-life doulas, and I was very interested. I had a pre-existing interest, but hadn't done much work on it, and she said she was keen to try and collaborate, and so I got a small pot of funding to do the first international study of end-of-life doulas with Mary Lynn, and so we interviewed a number of early innovators in the field, and we published that. And so maybe, if you link to my bio, there is all of my publications, and they're open access. And since then, I've gone on to publish multiple open access publications. And because I really am interested in working with practitioners in community-based spaces, I have also founded the End of Life Doula International Research Group. And it is not a standards or accreditation body, but rather brings together people in different countries who are interested in developing research around end-of-life doulas or death doulas or soul midwives, end-of-life consultants. They have many names. And one of the things that we're doing is conducting a study, a Delphi study, to try and better understand what collectively are the research priorities in the field. And the results of that will be available early in 2025.
Hmm. Well, that's really
Yeah.
fascinating. And
Well, I'm just sorry, I realized I gave you the technical details rather than the content. And I won't spend too much time, because literally I could take up the whole time on that topic. But one of the things that's been the most interesting is looking at what are the ways in which the field, as it develops, is able to contain the ambivalence and the tensions of both being a community-based and community-led practice versus kind of an emerging paraprofession, and also the ways in which it has some echoes of the history of hospice and palliative care development in the 60s and 70s and 80s.
hmm. Oh, that's definitely very interesting. So I'm gonna go take a look at some of your research and read more about
Yeah,
that.
please do.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. Well, initially you and I met to talk about the program at the University of Glasgow, and hopefully in the future I'll be able to interview some of the students from your program about the projects they've been working on. But I first wanted to just hear from you what the program consists of, and have you kind of tell us what it's like, what it consists of, and who can take part in it.
Well, yeah, and I this like the end of life doulas is a topic I'm really quite passionate about, and it's the reason I've decided to stay in Scotland rather than return to Canada, where I'm from the West Coast, and really loved living and working there, and my family is still there, but I don't think there really are many programs like this in the world. And so I've really been privileged to be able to head this up. And what it is a fully online program that is offered at a postgraduate level. And the goal is to offer new and critical interdisciplinary perspectives on end of life practice, looking at research and policy, innovations in care, ethical issues shaping the end of life, cultural representations of dying, death, and bereavement. And so I think for me, one of the things that I like best about it is that I came to higher education late in life. I didn't start my undergrad degree until I was 26. And I didn't graduate with my PhD until I was 45. And the idea of being able to offer a program where people who may have been out of school for a while are able to kind of dip their toe back in without necessarily committing to a whole master's degree. So what we have, it's called a stackable degree. So you can take one course, you can take 3 courses and get a PG certification, or you can take 6 courses, get a diploma. And then for those who want the full Masters of Science, they would do an additional dissertation course. And so we offer a whole range of, I'm biased, but I think super interesting courses. So we talk about global challenges and dilemmas in end of life care, which is a global scoping course. We look at the continuum of aging and dying. So rather than having those be separate, what is it like to think of aging and dying as a continuum? We have a whole course in assisted dying. We have one in theory, ethics, and methods in end-of-life research. We have cultural representations of dying, death, and bereavement, which is a great class because there's such a rich history of cultural representation. And then we also have a public health approach to the end-of-life course.
Mm.
So I can tell you a little bit more both about the content and the kind of practical details. Should I just keep going?
Sure. Just in case someone out there listening is thinking, I wonder if this would be a good fit for me. It just tell us a little more.
Well, so the goal here is to create a foundation to better understand and engage with these new patterns of aging and dying that we're seeing, and what are the implications for these for policy, practice, and research, and how to provide the skill set for people to be able to assist and support the capacity in those areas. It really is, so the entry requirements are pretty flexible. We do generally require an undergraduate degree, although we don't really care what it's in, as long as you have a substantive interest in end of life and end of life issues. We also have a non-traditional entry pathway, which is quite unusual for people who may not have a full undergraduate degree. So, for example, if people have substantive experience in the field, we may be able to transfer that into a admissions process. So, on the practical side, we offer the coursework both part-time and full-time, and we have 3 entry points a year. So people can start in September, they can start in January, or even April. And if that's too much, you can start with a micro credential. So we offer a 10-week, 10-credit course, and that provides both academic and continuing professional development credits. And we've had people take that course and then use that as a way to enter the program. And then as a kind of taster, we have a 3-week course, a MOOC, and it'll be linked hopefully in the show notes, where you can just go and take this course. It's over a period of 3 weeks. And it gives you a sense of some of the ways that we approach teaching and some of the topics. And right now, so the program started in January 2021, and to date, we've had learners from more than 20 countries, which has been really great.
Wow. I would
Yeah.
think that would be one of the unique experiences of being part of your program, is this ability to connect, excuse me, connect with learners from other countries and
Yeah.
just share the sharing of ideas and experiences.
That really has been one of the most significant benefits, just because the way that you describe it is true, is as wonderful as I think myself and the other other course conveners are. The idea that you can talk to people, like we have students from Nigeria that are talking to students in Finland, who are talking to South Korean missionaries in Myanmar and someone in rural Manitoba. And they all get to come together. Now, the program's fully asynchronous. So if people don't actually want to interact with another human being, they can. And so we do that because we want to be flexible, because people have different capacities at different times to study. But what we do is a once a week 90-minute seminar that's live, and that's where everybody comes together. And then for those who can't attend, we record it and have that up for the rest of the semester. But the student connection is immediate and quite fierce, actually. It's taken me a bit by surprise, because it is that kind of pre-existing interest in the field, and then you find your people. And you find these people in different parts of the world, and they want to talk about it in the same way, and you can learn from them. And so it's been really great, because we've even had student meetups each year where people will come just so that they can spend time together. So I've been putting together optional summer schools, and we have a student meetup that meets online once a week in addition to the seminar. They've got a really active WhatsApp group. We run a book club. So we are very keen on each other.
That sounds amazing. And I love what you said, that you develop your interest and you end up finding your people. Because I would say that happened to me through doing a podcast. Like, I never knew there were so many people that I could connect with in this deep way around conversations about death and dying and grief. And yet they're from everywhere. And the network ends up being much larger when you can do it online than if you were just trying to create this in one community.
You must know pretty much everyone, Karen, because, I look back at all of your episodes, and the ones that I've listened to as a longtime listener, but also the ones that I haven't. And it is a who's who of the world in the United States. And I think that's really amazing that everybody has come together through your interest and generosity of creating the space.
Well, it became clear to me that a podcast could actually become a hub where people could hear about someone else's work and make a connection with that person and come together. And at some point I realized that's actually the value of doing this, because I started to wonder, why is this important? Why does this matter? But then I started seeing it happen with my own eyes. And, you mentioned Mary Lynn Rush. Oh, I've interviewed Mary Lynn a few times, and that often happens. Someone will tell me about who they worked with in the past, and it's, oh yes, I met that person, I've interviewed them. And so I'm seeing how the networking all comes together, even in an international way, as you're saying. And yet there are a lot of students in your program that I'd love to meet. And so I'm really fascinated by the number of countries you mentioned that people have come from, and even to know that this movement, it's not just something that is happening here in the West, in the US or Canada. It sounds like it's happening everywhere.
I think it is. And, as an anthropologist who's interested in culture and cultural change, and how innovations and ideas circulate and spread, I do take an international perspective, and you do see it. You see the connections being made both within countries, but also between countries, that maybe don't have as many resources or the history of engaging with a topic in the same way being shared across national borders. And so it is, my goal is to be part of a distributed network of people, rather than having a more conventional hub and spoke model of there are these people who have the expertise and, you can get to know each other, but only if you go through, this hierarchy. And I think the increased interest in, death literacy or death education is really an example of people wanting that to be connected laterally, not just hierarchically.
That makes so much sense. And I'm curious about, so you have had some graduating classes, right?
Yes.
Already some students who've graduated, and I'm curious to know what they're doing now or how they've gone on to use this education.
Well, hopefully you will have a chance to ask them that themselves. But we started as a part-time program. And so we had our first graduating class that was in just a few months ago, which is one of the reasons why I'm so keen to have their voices be heard, because it was my first cohort. They are now finished, and some have gone on to publish their work, and some are going on to do PhD studies. Regardless of that, it was some of the work that they did that I found the most interesting, because they were happening in these different countries. And we continue to have new students do new forms of dissertation work. And so we've had nurses who have used, so critical care and palliative care nurses who have been in the program who have used their degree for promotion criteria. We have one nurse in the UK who used it to evaluate and implement a No One Dies Alone program in her hospital. We had another student who is retired used her dissertation to develop a program for those who are over the age of 85 and a local group around creating existential meaning in old age, which was really interesting, and now is an ongoing program in her town. We have students who are end of life doulas and have been using the dissertation project component to go deeper into their own practice or to better understand family experiences. And we have a student who's going to be publishing about her research, speaking with family members who have used end of life doulas. We have graduates in Canada who are very interested in assisted dying and have used their dissertation work to then go on to be board members of different national advocacy groups. And there are, more generally, we have had a gentleman here in Scotland who is a funeral celebrant, who did some of the very first work on the rise of Scottish funeral celebrants, and is working on publication, but is also looking now to have funding from the Churchill Foundation to make it an international study. We have someone in Mexico who is a retired psycho-oncologist, and she is developing from her dissertation work a grief program, because the existing resources are not fully supported or up to date. And I feel like I've missed out so many students. I have a student in Portugal who is looking at post-traumatic stress disorder in ICU survivors. So a whole wide range. I have a gentleman who just finished in South Africa who was looking at the provision of rural palliative care for Black South Africans in small communities.
Wow. It's just fascinating, the diversity of all the topics, and how just being part of this program is the ripple effect that it must be having around the world, and will continue to in the future. And just also the capacity, like I want to learn about every single one of their dissertations. I want to learn from them because I'm so fascinated. And that must be interesting to you as well as a convener, to even to see what your students are doing and how they're applying what they've learned in your program.
It's one of my well, if not the favorite part of the program, because so many of them, as you say, are doing genuinely interesting work that is relevant to them rather than it just being like an academic exercise. And, you know, one of the nurses we had, she looked at the existing research that exists in the exportation of nurses from sub-Saharan Africa into the UK, and the structuring of the National Health Service around the use of imported nurses and what that looks like in relation to beliefs around opioid use at the end of life, you know. And so each one has this real grounding in the everyday and what people are trying to engage with and change.
Mm. That's really fascinating. And I noticed like something I didn't read as part of your bio is that you have been also experiencing or researching experiences of ecological grief. And
Mm.
I'm really interested in that because I feel like that's another emerging issue that we have globally that is affecting everyone.
Yeah, well, this is something that I'm still in the initial stages of developing, but you know, I think like a lot of people, there's increasing sense of responsibility, and I have a lot of privilege as an academic, and I wondered how best to use that privilege, because I do think it is, you know, an incredibly, incredibly pressing matter. And I have stepchildren, and, you know, I teach at an undergraduate level too in my larger school. And I don't want to not have anything to say when somebody asks me, what did you do when you found out? And so I am looking at how theories and models of grief and loss can help us maybe better understand climate and environmental change and our emotional responses to it, because we have this idea outside of end of life, outside of the discipline, that grief is inherently a negative thing and that it needs to be minimized and eradicated. And one of my curiosities is, what if we use some of those understandings of what grief is in relation to some of the experiences that we seem to be having in relation to biodiversity and climate change, and have grief be a generative space to stand in rather than just be something to try and ignore, or at most just look. You would never say to someone who is grieving the loss of another human being or even a pet, what are the steps we can do to make you feel better right now? Don't worry about that feeling,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So I'm looking at using theories and models of grief, particularly with young people, in place-based activities where they work on rewilding and regeneration projects over 100-year lifespans, so that they will participate in something that they themselves will not see the end of, and how that might be able to be a space to talk about grief, and also sitting with difficult emotions as a site of long-term emotional resilience.
Wow. Oh, I love that. That really resonates with me. And I think you're so right. Wherever we shut down our own feelings of grief, because either we decide that they're they're not valuable or they don't make sense to feel grief about this, then we fail to go deeper and really connect with what's actually happening, with the loss that's actually happening. And I see that a lot around climate change, for one thing, because it has, for some reason, become a controversial issue that we feel like we have to be careful about discussing. And then we shut it down. We shut down the conversations. We even shut down our own feelings about it. So that's really powerful. So I'm also excited to see what you find and
Yes,
what you write
yes.
about
And
there.
I am actively looking for any students who are interested in that topic as I design a much larger project around this, because I do see the same thing happening in relation to a lot of these discussions where there's this feeling that we shouldn't talk about grief and loss unless it's in a really positive and cheerful way, the way that we talked about death and dying in some cases to this day, but certainly in not too many decades ago, that we needed to be protected from grief rather than to sit with it.
Mm.
So.
Yeah, so very true. We have a fear of our own pain in a way and other people's pain as well. So you're right. We
Well, we're
tend
not,
to,
we're not, and this is, this is why I'm also interested in intergenerational approaches, because nobody has taught us about how to sit with difficult feelings and how to value them. And so when the younger generations look to my generation and don't see us valuing grief and sitting with it, they inherit amnesia because they don't even know why they're feeling bad. They don't even know that it's grief because we haven't taught them.
mm, yeah, that's so true. Just decades of shutting it down and refusing to acknowledge it. And it has done harm to each one of us individually in our own lives, but to the collective and to the planet as well when we can't access those feelings. And as you said, just sit with them and be with them. It's interesting. I'm a grandmother. I have a 2-year-old granddaughter. She's now learning about emotions and feelings. And it's fascinating to see her. She'll say to me, "It's okay to feel sad, Grandma." And she said, "You feel sad sometimes, and that's okay." And so I realized, like, at such a young age, we can talk about it. We can sit with these feelings and we can make it be okay to have the feelings and experience it together. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for future generations that will do a
Well,
better
I think,
job.
the work that you do and the kind of work that I'm endeavoring to engage in both with my research and the program is to open it to conversation and different ways of thinking about it, and I know there is a lot of emphasis on death education and death literacy, sometimes in ways that to me can be a bit thin on the ground, which is, well, if you know where all the resources are and if you've done your advanced care planning, you're death literate. And one of the things about this program is being open to different cultural understandings of the end of life and what that means and what are the existential, what are the ethical, what are the cultural, what are the social, what are the personal feelings that shape the way that we collectively deal with what's happening. Because, we talk about the COVID pandemic as being unprecedented, but if you look back in history, we're having pandemics quite regularly, just at the edge of one lifetime's memory. But we have never, as a species, ever experienced the rate of aging and dying that we're currently in. And so that truly is unprecedented. And we need to have new ways of thinking and doing around this because what we're currently doing isn't working.
Yeah, so very true. And I would say, as a member of the medical profession, I've been frustrated for years and years with especially our US healthcare system and its approach to death and dying, and tried to think of ways to change the system from the inside. And I really would like your thoughts on this because it started to feel to me like it's not going to happen that way. It's too hard. It's like too big a
Yeah.
behemoth to try to change it, that we have to change our culture and our society, we have to change the awareness of people who are seeking care from that system in order to move the system. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
I think you're in an impossible position as a physician, and I have enormous compassion for that position, because you are in some ways being penalized for the very thing that has drawn you to do that work. And, I've worked embedded in clinical teams off and on throughout my professional career. And I had projects where the clinicians would say, this is amazing, this is great, and they can't take it anywhere. Because I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of the system? And if you think of the medical system, and of course, the United States has differences to the Canadian universal system, to the NHS here in the UK, and others that have blended systems. But by and large, healthcare systems are for efficiency of scale. So are we asking something that is impossible to do within that logic? And if so, what then are the alternatives? And I don't think it's an all or nothing. I think we have seen a shift within healthcare systems, the advent of hospice and palliative care, although, that seems like a long time ago now, that is still relatively recent, post-World War II. And we continue to have lots of changes within those systems. And so I don't want to demonize them, but rather just turn away from them being the only source. And I think more and more people are attempting to do that.
Mm. I think you're so very right about that. And one thing that occurred to me, as you said, are we asking the system to provide something that it was never meant to provide in the first place? I've thought of that with some of my medical colleagues who, we're upset because they're not having end of life conversations with patients, but they've never been trained to do that. And it's not their skill set. It's not even their interest. It's not why they became a doctor. And then I think, do we have expectations that are not really reasonable? And do we need to provide those services in other ways to meet the needs of patients, but without demanding that the system or the practitioners in the system change how they operate in order to meet those needs? And I don't really
it's
know.
Interesting to me because we have quite a few physicians in our program, some who are only taking one class, some who are taking more, and they don't need more accreditation, that they're certainly not doing it for more credentials, but they're doing it because they, like you, are looking for ways to think collectively. And one of my favorite sayings is that a good idea is always a collective endeavor.
Mm. Mm. I really like that. And I think many of us, I'm older, of course, and at the time when I went through medical training, I felt so very alone most of the time in the way I thought about things, the big picture thinking that I had, and the way I thought about the system itself and how it operated. And so I can see the value of finding like-minded people also to share with and to feel validated by could be really helpful when you're trying to just stand up and put a stake in the ground and make a point and to stand for something maybe a little different than status quo.
Well, and I think, I'm going to overgeneralize here, but I think we're all exhausted. I think we're all inflamed. And I mean that on quite a literal cellular level as well as like a social level. And I think wherever we can find communities of the unalike that, maybe are coming from, we've got people who are artists, who are videographers. We have people who are retired. We have clinicians, we have missionaries, and they are very unalike, but they have a common interest. And I have stolen that phrase from Dame Cicely Saunders from the hospice movement, who said, "We are a community of the unalike." And that's always stuck with me, because the thing about these kinds of interactions that you and I can have, or within my program, or in multiple other ways, is it brings together people who don't necessarily think alike, but have the same underlying desires to be together and to create those kind of collective ideas that suit a diversity of needs rather than just what is most expedient.
And I love that. And because death and grief are universal experiences for us, uh, it's like the perfect, what do I want to say? The perfect center point for a community of the unalike to come together around that particular topic. We all will experience it and will share in it, and even though it will be a totally different experience for each one of us.
Yeah, and I think, that's why I love my job so much, is because I get to continue to learn from so many different people. And in many ways, academia itself is an institution and a system, just like healthcare is. And it can encourage specific ways of doing things. So I do sometimes feel like I'm going to get caught out because I'm in this corner of a very old established university doing these radical things with radical people and doing it in a way that is really significant for the people who are there rather than just saying, okay, here you've got your educational credentials, or, that was kind of an interesting project. These are things that I think for me, one of the things is how do we build on our passions, our capacities, and our everyday life? And that when we're so exhausted and so inflamed, to be able to offer space that I get myself to learn from seems like an unbelievable privilege.
Mm,
And gets me
yes.
to talk to people like you, like quite literally, we wouldn't be talking. I
Yeah.
would just be listening and going, oh,
Yeah.
how interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So very true. Um, it's just so exciting to think about what's possible. And from what I've heard, your program sounds very unique in the world, but I would love it if there were more programs like this in more countries around the world.
I think it's a start, and I don't think we'll be the last. And I think there are some good programs elsewhere that have some similarities. But one of the things for us is that we offer a Master of Science, not a Master of Arts. And so I think that's a really big draw because for many people, if they have an arts degree, that keeps them from entering into this field, except in a very predefined path, like an arts and humanities perspective. And so, just for example, today I was talking to somebody from Brazil who wants to join the program, and she was looking to do she was saying, well, maybe I should do it in psychology, but I'm also interested in your program. And the program convener wrote back and said, I'm sorry, we don't accept people without a science BA or a BSc. And I said, come over here. We have all kinds of different people, and it doesn't keep you being in an interdisciplinary program doesn't keep you from then, if you decide, going on to pursue a science-based career because you have that scientific certification. And that's what I think I mean by often these kinds of systems, whether they be educational or medical, it's an economy of scale. And so here we're trying to do things a little bit differently. And some of the other programs that I can see, they've got some really great material, but either it's not accredited or it's arts-based or those kinds of things that I don't in any way malign, but just that we've tried to engage with in a slightly different manner.
Hmm. So, say if someone were interested in your program, how do they go about learning more, applying for it? It sounds like you have conversations with potential students.
Yeah, yeah, because it is such a special program. I do, as the program convener, I have a conversation with each prospective student before they apply. Ideally, sometimes it's after they apply to get a better sense of who they are and what they want from the program and how we might be able to best fit that. And so there is on the University of Glasgow webpage, again, hopefully you'll link to it, End of Life Studies. there is a application form, and there's also my email address. And so I'd encourage people to email me in the first instance, and we can have further conversation. But I've also had people apply, and then once that application comes through to me, then I have a conversation. And so, as I said, we've admitted people without bachelor's degrees if they have very substantive experience, and we've also welcomed quite a few people who have been out of school for a long period of time and who may feel nervous about coming into a postgraduate environment. And some people come with a very predefined project they want to focus on. And so it's always good to talk about how we can support that within the program. There's lots of ways in which having that conversation is really helpful for both myself and the students who come in, so that I know that once the students are in the program, that they are going to be well supported and that they have a sense of what to expect.
And about how many students are in a cohort? Although I realize it's probably not.
Well, so this is the challenge, is because we have 3 intakes a year. So our cohorts are very kind of heterogeneous. But I believe this semester we have 19 students. And so that's not including our dissertation students. Those are just the students in the main program. So that's about approximate. We have about anywhere between 15 to 25 students in the program at any one time. So, and it's actually been really great because the students who've been in the program longer really act as mentors in some instances to the students who are just coming in. And so there's kind of this ongoing transfer of knowledge throughout the academic years, which has been really amazing to see.
Well, so that's nice that it's a small enough group to allow for more intimate connections and truly getting to know your fellow classmates, if that's what you're seeking.
Yeah, if that's what you're seeking. I've only had one, but I did have one student who went through the whole program and I never talked to them in real time. We just communicated through email. And that works. There are people who have that preference. And then, my student in South Africa lived in an area where there were rolling blackouts and internet outages. And so, sometimes the way, once they got to their dissertation, we communicated through extensive voice memos, so we're always really flexible and looking for ways, because our students literally are all over the world and don't always have the exact same technological capacities as we take for granted.
Yes. Yeah, I can imagine that. Well, I'm curious to know, just looking ahead, what do you think are some key things that will shape the future for end of life studies?
Well, this is my favorite topic, or I have a lot of favorite topics, don't I? I am really interested in innovations and changes. And so I've thought about this a lot. And I think so you have internationalization happening more and more. Like, we know that end-of-life care and death practices can really vary greatly across cultures and geographies, but as the world is getting more and more interconnected, it's going to be really important to study that through a global lens. And this is particularly true with the growing number of refugees and displaced populations worldwide. Like, we look at some of the end-of-life care practices in Rohingya, and providing palliative care in emergency situations and humanitarian crises, I think, is going to be increasingly important. What else? Oh, social justice. I think, looking at the social justice issues inherent in palliative and hospice care provision. These services, they're often called or described as like a heaven for the few, because they tend to be available to those with financial means or like geographic proximity or social capital to access them. So marginalized groups, whether that be those facing structural marginalization, people in rural areas, belonging to minority or racialized groups, they often face significant barriers in receiving quality end-of-life care. So thinking about end-of-life and end-of-life care as a space for social justice concerns. I think there's also, in relation to this, a growing desire for control and personalization of the end of our lives, and the way that our bodies are treated after death, and how we're mourned. People want to make autonomous decisions in many countries about their care, including when and how they die, where and how they die, what kind of specific treatments they might want, or forego. And this is really, I think, connected to this broader cultural and social trend towards personalization, where people want tailored care plans, reflecting their unique selves. But I think, and we touched on this earlier, there is, I believe, a growing tension between professionalization and public health approaches, because palliative and hospice care, in many instances, is a medicalized form of death. And in many instances, people die without even access to palliative and hospice care. But then you have these public health approaches that aim to bring death back into the community. And so I think really we're going to need to look at how we balance these models. So examining how professional expertise in palliative care can coexist with community-led initiatives like end-of-life doulas, compassionate communities. And so ensuring that these professional care supports still exist without undermining local or culturally relevant practices. And I can't leave without saying something about the impact of climate change on end-of-life care. One of the interests I have, although I don't study it, is the economic cost of end-of-life care. There's an enormous amount of medical waste in relation to end-of-life in hospital settings. But, the impact of climate change is already affecting healthcare systems in certain global conditions. And we need to better understand how things like extreme weather events, displacements, and resource scarcity is going to influence palliative care provision. And I think also we're going to want to look at new support systems for mental health and bereavement in communities that are experiencing large-scale environmental or social disruptions. And I think by and large, the global north has so far emerged relatively unscathed. I say that with a lot of asterisks and provisos. But I also think that AI, for example, is going to reconfigure how technology is used in palliative care. I'm on review boards for quite a few different journals, and the use of AI at the end of life is really ticking upwards. And so let's see, do I have anything else? I'm going to say that the last thing is really about this movement, whether it be end-of-life doulas or the rise of funeral celebrants, this movement towards personal expertise in supporting others. So the death literacy and having increased capacity, looking at how best to support through non-conventional or non-traditional medical systems. And that includes things like psychedelic therapies. That's increasingly becoming integrated into healthcare, but started outside of healthcare and still is at the margins. And the increasing interest in things such as sustainable burials and different ways of body disposal, and how that's going to shape burial practice and rituals. I'm going to stop there.
Well, it's fascinating. And I like having that future perspective of what's coming, because we already see these movements taking shape, like artificial intelligence and the effects of climate change right now. And it's good to do the forward thinking so that we can prepare ourselves better, if possible, for changes that may be coming down the road. So and
even shape our response to some of them, and here in the UK, in Scotland in particular, we're currently tabling an assisted dying bill. and, the concern around what happens when that gets implemented, that's increasingly changing, as more and more countries are legislating it. And, that's creating enormous cultural changes in the countries that it's happening in. And so a better understanding of, as that continues to expand on a global context, what does that look like for our understanding what the end of life actually means?
Mm. So very true. It's fascinating. I really enjoyed taking this look at what's happening in the world right now, and also hearing about your program at the University of Glasgow. And I have a feeling that there will be people listening who may find their way to your website or to your program, excuse me, in the
Well,
future.
as I say, I welcome the ongoing development of the community of the unalike, because clearly there are people who are looking for that, and there are many tents. We are not the only tent, and I like the idea of belonging to a community of tents, so it's not about empire building, but it is about, people who are looking to change and engage in that change of this landscape. Many of them are seeking some form of credentials, and there is a lot of positives and negatives that go with that. But along with it, if you can be able to do work that you see yourself as relevant to what you want to do while getting those credentials, rather than it just being purely academic, I think is something that increasingly people are going to be looking for. And I'd be happy to talk to them about that.
Mm. That's that sounds wonderful. Well, I just really enjoyed talking with you, Marian, and I look
Thank
forward
you.
to staying in touch, because I'd love to get acquainted with some of your graduates and hear about their work and share that with listeners as well. And then just to hear updates from time to time on how things are going.
Yes. I would like that very much too, and hopefully we will be able to facilitate some of the graduates coming on and speaking in their own words about the work that they've done and continue to do.
Yeah, I would really enjoy that. Well, thank you for joining me from all the way around the world in Scotland. It always amazes me that we're able to connect like this, and I'm really grateful that you gave me your time.
Well, and in turn, I'm grateful for the opportunity. So well met.
Yes. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about the End of Life Studies program at the University of Glasgow with Marian Krawczyk, and that you'll look into it if you find it might be a good fit for you. And you can go to the show notes to find links that we talked about for the program, for Marian's website, and also ways to get in touch with her. So I'll be back next time with another interview with you. And until then, take care. Goodbye.